War. Mahatma Gandhi, feminism, and the occult. How did these all influence Western vegetarianism in the early 1900s? In a period that carried over a world of empires on the verge of crisis, there were some individuals invoking pacifism. And whilst a technological revolution hurtled civilizations towards modernity by exerting its dominion over environment, there were movements calling for harmonization with nature. Associating itself with these cultural reformations was the vegetarian movement of the 20th century. The late 1800s had revived ideologies such as socialism and romanticism. These were then echoed in the 1900s through movements of food reformation, social justice, and primitivism. Movements which greatly assisted in the vegetarian case for health, ethics, and environment. At the beginning of the 20th century, England's vegetarian society had already been established for more than 50 years. However, there was a decline in the widespread support for vegetarianism here, as Britain had been one of the hardest hit in the worldwide economic long depression of the 19th century. The gains for the vegetarian cause that had been made during the Victorian era were being diminished as living standards amongst many of the population had plummeted to all-time lows. Dietary choice was less of a practicality. Whilst the Edwardian rich dined in luxurious excess of dairy, sugar, and meat, malnutrition amongst the poor in Britain was as bad as that of medieval times. The mass of the most impoverished families were living off a diet of just white bread and tea. During the Second Anglo-Boer War, it was reported by Sir William Taylor, Director General Army Medical Service, that it was difficult to find men sufficiently healthy enough to fight. About 40% of men that came to enlist for the British infantry, mostly from a working class background, were rejected as medically unfit for military service. In the aftermath of a surprisingly long and difficult war for the British, the Empire's veneer of impenetrable global dominance was beginning to be questioned. Newspapers and writers related the problems of the British Empire with the poor health of many British people. How could an unhealthy nation rule the largest empire in the world? Malnutrition throughout infancy had stunted growth, given them weak hearts and poor eyesight. This compelled the government to carry out an investigation into the nation's diet. Amongst the poorest, it was found to be so inadequate that women couldn't even breastfeed their babies. And despite the vegetarian activist Dr. Thomas Allinson having been a proponent for the superiority of wholemeal in previous years, it was still a common misguided belief at the time that white bread was equally as nutritious. Growing children suffered particularly from the shortage of fats, vegetables, and fruit in their diet, which made diseases like rickets common. Semi-skilled laborers had a slightly better diet of potatoes, suet puddings, milk and jam, in addition to the standard bread and tea, and maybe afforded a cheap cut of meat once a month, which, among the working class, went primarily to the man of the household, as the breadwinner needed the most sustenance, with the mother and children going short in their daily meals. Meat was a luxury not to be giving up lightly. Because of this extreme poverty, the vegetarian movement remained mostly middle class into the early 1900s, despite them offering help and advising that their diet was both economical and nutritious. They were mostly ignored by the working class. Vegetarianism was seen as sacrificing a precious part of the already insubstantial foods available. So it seemed this idealism could only thrive where food was in abundance. From 1906, the new Liberal government started to introduce welfare reforms, causing the social circumstances in Britain to begin to improve. This included free school meals for children, national health insurance, and pensions for the elderly. Yet there were still some liberties for women that would have to be fought for. And one group where vegetarianism did manage to span and thrive across the classes was in the feminist suffrage campaign. It included celebrities from the upper class like Lady Constance Lytton, daughter to the Earl of Lytton, but also amongst the working class were examples like Lenora Cohen and her family. She was a daughter of a widowed seamstress, and Lenora herself apprenticed as a hatmaker. Belief in contemporary theories of the health benefits was what initiated both women to the vegetable diet. Constance Lytton had suffered from what she called constitutional rheumatism from infancy, which, after listening to some research from her aunt, she switched to being vegetarian. Lenora was afflicted with tuberculosis as a child, and her father had already died from it. So, after taking advice from a professor, her mother put the whole family on a strict vegetarian regime. The politics naturally followed, with vegetarianism already having an established association with progressive socio-political movements. Its ethos was attractive amongst the feminists. On one level, from an empathy with the mistreated animals in the production of meat, seen as comparable to the subservient secondary place of women in patriarchal society. Thus, while campaigning for the right to vote, many suffragettes also passionately were against eating meat, vivisection, the wearing of fur coats, and stuffed bird hats. But perhaps one of the most appealing aspects of vegetarianism that were promoted to working mothers at the time were its time-saving and economic practicalities, with the diet supposedly offering a freedom from the traditional feminine ties to the kitchen. 1,000 or so suffragettes were imprisoned up until the First World War for their civil disobedience or public order offences. Advice was spread to the inmates that the ordinary mixed prison food supplied was most unpalatable, and that it was better to choose the vegetarian option, which was nicer in every way. One prisoner, Margaret C. Clayton, wrote in 1907,
"Dinner is supplied in 2 tins. In the deeper one lurk 2 potatoes in their skins. In the shallower, which fits into the top of the other, are an egg and some cauliflower or other vegetable. Many of us are always vegetarians, and acting on expert advice, others are so pro tem, for the meat supplied is so generally disliked."
From 1909, it was common for the suffragettes to use hunger strikes in a call for treatment as political prisoners. The first of those starving themselves were released temporarily to prevent martyrdom, but this was unsustainable, so the government took more drastic action, brutally force-feeding the women with tubes, which left lasting physical and mental damage to their health. Suffragettes released from London's Holloway prison were being welcomed by the Women's Social and Political Union, sometimes with breakfasts hosted at a vegetarian restaurant near Charing Cross, the Eustace Miles, perhaps the most famous of vegetarian restaurants in Edwardian London, which even got a brief mention in E.M. Foster's novel Howard's End.
"Next time," she said to Mr. Wilcox, "you shall come to lunch with me at Mr. Eustace Miles's."
With pleasure.
"No, you'd hate it," she said, pushing her glass towards him for some more cider. "It's all proteins and bodybuildings, and people come up to you and beg your pardon, but you have such a beautiful aura."
A what?
Never heard of an aura? Oh, happy, happy man. I scrub at mine for hours. Nor of an astral plane?
The restaurant was owned by the tennis player and health fanatic of its namesake, and other shareholders like playwright and influencer of the vegetarian movement, George Bernard Shaw, who also hosted suffrage dinner events at the restaurant in support of the women's political cause. Also, French master chef Escoffier had apparently praised the food of the then chef of the restaurant, Mr. Blatch. However, top restaurant critic Lieutenant Colonel Newham Davis had a mixed review. He was impressed by some of the menu, but noted that watery stuffed marrows wasn't enough to wean him away from the errors of flesh eating. Eustace Miles, the man, despite eating a lacto-vegetarian diet, did not like to be labelled as such a vegetarian. In his book, Failures of Vegetarianism, he made his views explicit on the philosophy. expressing that vegetarianism had become associated with badly cooked vegetables, and the vegetarians, by becoming too dogmatic, ethically self-elevated, and making exaggerated claims, had somewhat alienated the general public away from their ideals, which in essence he maintained were sound. Instead, he believed in a diet of simpler foods and was open to a more empirical, rational approach to humans' eating habits.
How on earth can one expect to help people by soaring above them, and by utterly refusing to consider their point of view?
As for the Women's Social and Political Union, it was increasingly becoming connected with violent acts of terrorism. So, in 1907, some members broke away to form a more pacifist organization, the Women's Freedom League, headed by vegetarian Charlotte Despard. In relation to her suffrage work, Charlotte Despard would meet Mohandas Gandhi in 1909, and later in 1931 she became vice president of the London Vegetarian Society. A very religious person, Despard had converted to Roman Catholicism as well as joining the Theosophy Society, an occult movement incorporating ideologies such as Neoplatonism, Buddhism, and mysticism. Theosophy had a strong connection with the Western vegetarian movement since their origins in the 19th century. Nonconformist spirituality, as did other movements of the early 20th century, would also have an association with vegetarianism, including the temperance movement and, controversially, anti-vaccination propagators. England had a movement opposing compulsory vaccination throughout the Victorian era. By the 1890s, Scotland was following suit, with many of the vegetarian restaurants being the centres of anti-vax campaigns, and not only because the vaccine against smallpox used cow-calf lymphs, which vegetarians found unacceptable, but also as vegetarianism of this time was often in conjunction with the misguided belief in alternative or more natural medicines such as fresh air, hydropathy, and the vegetarian diet to cure most ailments. Dr. Archibald Hunter's hydropathic establishment in Stirling was taken over by his widow, Agnes Hunter. She was a vegetarian and frequent contributor to anti-vaccination propaganda in the Scottish Health Reformer, a publication started in 1903 which predominantly supported the vegetarian lifestyle, and by 1905 had a dedicated column for the anti-vaccination movement. Ideologies of the previous century influencers like George Bernard Shaw, Tolstoy, Henry Salt, and Edward Carpenter were being put into practice in the 1900s amongst a few middle-class institutes. The progressive education movement saw the creation of several private schools which advocated the vegetarian diet, in a utopian aspiration of ending world violence by teaching children pacifism before adulthood. Those established already by the 20th century were Abbotsholme, founded in 1889 by Cecil Ready, and Bedales in 1893 by John Hayden Baddeley. These schools, which catered especially for vegetarians, had been created to be humane alternatives to the authoritarian regimes, typical of late Victorian public schools. In 1915, in association with the Theosophy Society, the school St. Christopher's at Letchworth Garden City was established with an entirely vegetarian diet for pupils. Others were Pinehurst School in Heathfield, the Garden School Hyde Wycombe, and in the 1920s, Quaker schools also began to cater for vegetarians. This movement was ideologically anti-urban, so schools tended to be located in the countryside with an emphasis on children having close contact with nature, which involved them gardening, sunbathing, and sleeping out in the open air. Ideals which would have been drawn upon from 19th century Romanticism and the emerging German naturist movement. A particularly influential book from 1903 would have been Return to Nature by Adolf Just, a German naturopath who advocated fresh air, morning fasts, sun and earth baths, and a raw vegetarian diet of unprocessed foods. Just's ideology was Christianized, but based on the idea that salvation could be regained by awareness of how early man used to live. His belief was that in the beginning, all creatures lived in harmony with the Creator, and that whilst animals remained in their unspoilt state, man had fallen from grace. Another thinker of the time who challenged the traditional views of Christianity, in particular its attitude towards animals, was Reverend John Todd Ferrier, which made him break from the Congregational Church in 1903, and in 1904 he founded his own informal spiritual fellowship of vegetarian Christians, the Order of the Cross. His teachings show that many of the Christian philosophies are mystical and allegorical in nature, and he believed that a true Christian should be a vegetarian to comply with the tenets of peace and love. In the early days of the vegetarian movement, its propaganda was mostly communicated through the intellectual realm, and not much was recorded of strong athletes on a vegetarian diet that would provide real examples of its health benefits. Towards the end of the 19th century, there appeared a few examples, such as the formation of small vegetarian cycle clubs. Then, in 1908, tennis player Eustace Miles would receive worldwide recognition by winning an Olympic medal. But throughout the early 20th century, there was another prominent figure in the sporting world challenging the weak body stereotype. The German bohemian athlete Emmerich Rath was a champion of heavyweight boxing, marathon running, skiing, rowing, and many more sports, winning over 500 competitions across Europe in his lifetime. Every time after winning, he would always proudly mention that he was a long-time vegetarian. Rath was particularly famous at the time for breaking records in 50-kilometer races, carrying 30 kilograms of military equipment. During his competitions, he kept his energy up with raisins, nuts, and grape juice. It is said that his feats called the attention of the German Reich Ministry of War, who considered introducing meatless rations into the army. He was invited for consultations, but later the idea was abandoned. His ascetic lifestyle was accompanied by great feats of altruism and heroism, including one tragedy that is occasionally remembered for, the 1913 skiing race on the Czech Highlands, in which Rath attempted to rescue two other skiers that had gone missing during a snowstorm. He stuck to his vegetarian diet through 2 world wars and was a propagator for it the rest of his life. Also within the sporting realm, the United States was seeing a local college football team become flag bearers of an emerging Chicago-based meat-free philosophy, the Chicago University Maroons, who were on a strict vegetarian diet at the suggestion of coach Amos Alonzo Stagg. It was reported amongst the press with skepticism as an experiment expected not to last. Ironically, Chicago being considered the capital of the US meat-packing industry, by the 20th century was also already the center of America's vegetarian movement. During this period, the city saw an unrivaled growth in the number of new vegetarian restaurants, publications, grocery stores, social clubs, and perhaps the most influential meeting of international vegetarian delegates, the Vegetarian Congress, took place at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The Jungle, a novel published in 1906, undoubtedly had influence in the movement's continued success. The author, Upton Sinclair, had researched the Chicago meat industry and wrote the book to portray the cruel treatment of animals within the slaughterhouses and the grotesque conditions the exploited workers had to endure. One part graphically describes the horrific environment in which live hogs are hoisted up with chains ready for butchery.
There was a double line of them, each dangling by a foot and kicking in frenzy. And squealing. The uproar was appalling, perilous to the eardrums. One feared there was too much sound for the room to hold, that the walls must give way, or the ceiling crack.
Meatpacking was one of the first American industries to develop the assembly line, processing thousands of animals per day. Its brutal efficiency would be the inspiration for Henry Ford's car manufacturing process. Instead, for the slaughterhouses, it is more accurately described as a disassembly. At fixed stations, workers would have separate tasks, from the killing of the animal to the leg breakers, gutters, and the job described as the protagonists in the jungle, a shoveler of guts. The dangerous work was undertaken by unskilled immigrants, having to stand all day in pools of blood, bone, and urine. Frequent were gruesome accidents of men losing fingers and falling into vats of boiling lard. Yet it was his description of diseased, rotten, and contaminated meat that had the most impact on audiences, which caused meat sales in the United States to slump and did not revive for another 20 years. Not from any concern of dehumanized immigrants or animal welfare. Rather, it was the public fear of health risks from tubercular-ridden beef. Sinclair's comment on the unintended reaction was,
I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach.
The consolation, at least, was that the outrage was followed by hundreds of letters a day to the White House, demanding a cleanup of the meat industry, which then led President Roosevelt to order a federal investigation and ultimately bringing in new legislation for food hygiene and safety. However, despite the standards of health, safety, and animal welfare having improved somewhat, even into the 21st century, abattoirs throughout the world still rely heavily on unskilled, vulnerable migrants or those from poor backgrounds to work in this brutal environment, which is still considered to be a highly dangerous job, with many cases of amputations, increased risk to cancer from exposure to blood pathogens, and psychological trauma. Sinclair himself went through periods of being vegetarian. He did also explore meat eating at times, but predominantly preferred a raw diet of vegetables and nuts. From his interest in health and nutrition, he wrote another book on the health benefits of fasting. Whilst the Vegetarian Federal Union sat in one corner of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, another advocate of vegetarianism, the genius inventor Nikola Tesla, was also demonstrating his electricity inventions at the exposition. Throughout most of his life, Tesla ate predominantly a diet of vegetables, milk, and fish, with the rare addition of meat sparingly. In later years, he became increasingly more restrictive in his diet, which incidentally was vegetarian. His ascetic lifestyle eschewed acid-producing foods and stimulants like coffee and tobacco. But, contradictory, he believed whiskey was a veritable elixir of life. He was known to drink every day and looked anorexic towards his last years. However, in old age, he stated that he felt in excellent health and full of energy. In an article for Century Illustrated magazine, Tesla was giving ecological warnings back in 1900 on the problem of human food resources in an ever-growing population. He remarks,
Millions of individuals die yearly for want of food, thus keeping down the mass. How to provide good and plentiful food is, therefore, a most important question of the day. On general principles, the raising of cattle as a means of providing food is objectionable, because in the sense interpreted above, it must undoubtedly tend to the addition of mass of a smaller velocity. It is certainly preferable to raise vegetables, and I think therefore that vegetarianism is a commendable departure from the established barbarous habit.
Russian writer Leo Tolstoy was all too familiar with the problem of food resources as he had lived through the Russian famine of 1891. Having organized free food kitchens for the starving poor, the economical vegetarian diet his humanitarian efforts provided received high praise, the peasants declaring that they had never eaten better food. Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy wrote some of the most seminal literary works of the 19th century. His philosophical beliefs of Christianity and pacifism ultimately culminated into his vegetarianism, but the transition to the diet was gradual. In the last 2.5 decades of his life, he had given up animal food completely, eating mostly bread, vegetable soup, and oatmeal. Thanks to the fame of the author, vegetarianism became quite popular with 20th century Russia. Several vegetarian societies were established in the early 1900s, including the Moscow Vegetarian Society in 1909, of which Tolstoy was made its honorary member. In 1910, he died of pneumonia at a lonely train station in Astapovo, Russia. It is said that on his final journey, he preached love and non-violence to his fellow passengers on the train. His ideas of non-violent resistance would go on to have a profound impact on the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. Ironically, despite Gandhi having been raised in India, the country which had heavily influenced Western vegetarianism for over 300 years, in 19th century India, there was a strong anti-vegetarian movement, and Gandhi felt a great internal conflict between his parents' traditional Hindu values and the modern sentiment that meat-eating would make one and the country strong enough to defeat their imperial overlords, the British. This came in response to a European conviction instilled upon the people that vegetarianism had made the Indians weak and subservient. Gandhi went to England for an education in law, and despite his negative beliefs on vegetarianism, he kept a solemn promise to his mother not to give way to British culture of flesh-eating and wine-drinking. Yet, London was the turning point for Gandhi after discovering the writings of Western vegetarians, most significantly the father of animal rights, Henry Salt, and the inspirational advocate for non-violent protest, Percy Shelley. Thereafter, he became committed to the vegetarian ideology and joined the London Vegetarian Society. In 1893, Gandhi went to South Africa to work as a lawyer for his uncle. Despite thinking himself primarily as a British citizen, being a non-white here, he faced harsh racial discrimination, yet he decided to stay to fight for the rights of Asians in Africa, and from December 1899 to February of 1900 challenged the held perception that Indians were cowards by participating in the Second Boer War. Forming a group of volunteer stretcher bearers, 1,100 strong, the Natal Indian Ambulance Corps, with expenses raised by the local Indian community themselves. They would carry wounded soldiers from the front line, sometimes marching 25 miles a day. For their service, the leaders of the Corps, including Gandhi, received the Queen's South African Medal. Although he felt loyalty to the British Empire, he also sympathized with the Dutch-descended Boers. During his time in South Africa, he tried to convert Boer children to vegetarianism in an attempt to combat the racial barrier between Europeans and Asians through teaching them a reverence for life. A vegetarian restaurant in Johannesburg is where Gandhi met Albert West and Henry Pollack, who became his associates in forging the movement of Satyagraha, his form of non-violent resistance in the struggle for civil rights, and with whom he also founded the 2 vegetarian communal settlements. First Phoenix in 1904, inspired by John Ruskin's idea of a life of labor, and then Tolstoy Farm in 1910, named of course after the Russian philosopher Leo Tolstoy, whose book The Kingdom of God is Within You greatly influenced Gandhi. The experiments were to realize the romantic ideal of returning to nature. He created a self-reliant monastic-like village populated with multiracial, multi-faith mix of men, women and children who all participated in farming, gardening and sewing clothes, working together for the good of all. The food they ate on the communes would have been intentionally simple and quite bland, avoiding any condiments, which in Gandhi's way of thinking was to assist in achieving harmony with nature and cultivating Hindu yoga virtues of temperance. They made their own bread, nut butter, cereal-based coffee, and marmalade from fruits on the farm. Living close to nature in South Africa meant having contact with dangerous animals, with which a harmonious relationship had to be established. Killing was forbidden as a foundational rule, but maintaining some pragmatism, Gandhi did tolerate unavoidable himsa, the Indian concept of violence, to protect himself and residents from pests like mosquitoes, and on one occasion he ordered the killing of a snake when it was impossible to put it out of harm's way. After 21 years in South Africa, helping to fight against discrimination and developing his ethical and political views, Gandhi decided it was time to return to his motherland, India. But first he wanted to make a short stopover in England. He set off in July 1914. During the journey, the entire world would enter into war. He would have to make decisions once again where his principles of non-violence had its place amongst the hardships that the whole world would now face. Some prominent figures carried the ideas of vegetarianism of the previous century into the 20th. And as a result of growth in vegetarian movements worldwide, the International Vegetarian Union was established in 1908. Nevertheless, with the outbreak of the First World War, vegetarians would now have to cope as best as they could. With mass human suffering, violence and food rationing on the horizon, how would concerns of animal suffering, ideas of pacifism, and a diet abstaining from meat hold up?